There comes a moment when loss no longer arrives with drama or intensity. It arrives quietly, settling into the body like a heavy fog that refuses to lift. She didn't cry anymore, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it had exhausted every tear she had. Her mornings no longer carried expectation, only obligation. Another day to survive, another set of hours to endure without knowing what she was enduring them for. What hurt the most was not what she had lost along the way, but what was missing now. The sense that life was still listening to her. Dreams had slipped away one by one, not violently, but gently, like lights being turned off in empty rooms. Somewhere in that slow dimming, she stopped reaching for anything new, afraid that hope itself had become too expensive to maintain. She had given everything she knew how to give. Effort, faith, time, love, patience. And still, she found herself standing in the aftermath, wondering how someone could do everything right and end up with nothing left to hold. Her strength had been consumed by trying, her belief worn thin by waiting without answers. Inside her, a silence had taken root, heavier than grief itself. It followed her through ordinary moments, through simple routines that once felt meaningful. While washing dishes, while staring out the window, while listening to the world move forward without her, she felt as if life had quietly passed her by. Have you ever reached a point where you no longer know what to ask for, where the question is no longer whether something will work, but whether it makes sense to try again at all? She lived inside that question now, carrying it without language, without protest, without clarity. She stopped imagining a future, not out of bitterness, but exhaustion. The future had become something distant and abstract, almost irrelevant. All that mattered was making it through the day without collapsing under the weight of disappointment she carried silently, invisibly, faithfully. And yet, beneath that exhaustion, something fragile remained. Not hope, not yet, but a thin awareness that whispered she was still here. Still breathing. Still present. Even when everything meaningful seemed gone. She didn't know it then, but this emptiness was not a punishment. It was preparation, quietly making space for something that could only arrive when there was nothing left to cling to. This was the moment before everything changed, not the miracle itself, but the stillness that made room for it. As the days passed, the weight she carried seemed to grow heavier, not because anything new had happened, but because nothing had changed. Fear settled into her chest in a quiet, persistent way, not the kind that panics, but the kind that convinces you this is as far as life will go. She feared waking up years from now in the same place, with the same unanswered questions, realizing that time had moved on without her. Loneliness wrapped itself around her even in familiar spaces. She could be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly alone, as if no one could truly see how close she was to giving up. There were things she wanted to say, truths she wanted to release, but they felt too heavy, too vulnerable to be spoken aloud. So she carried them inward, where disappointment quietly took root. Discouragement followed her like a shadow. Every attempt to move forward seemed to lead back to the same place, reinforcing the belief that effort was pointless and hope unreliable. She questioned her worth, her timing, her place in the world, wondering if she had misunderstood life entirely. It wasn't anger she felt, but a deep, aching tiredness of believing without results. In moments of honesty, she admitted how close she was to surrendering, not dramatically, but quietly, by lowering her expectations until nothing could hurt anymore. And if you are listening now and recognize yourself in this exhaustion, in this silent questioning, she would want you to know you're not alone in it. Sometimes, just acknowledging that truth is the first act of kindness we offer ourselves. If this part of her story feels familiar, you might pause for a moment and leave the word gratitude in the comments, not because everything is solved, but because even here, something inside you is still listening. Still open. Still breathing beneath the weight. She would also gently remind you that stories like this find us for a reason. If you feel called to stay connected, subscribing is simply a way of choosing not to walk this path alone, of allowing yourself to receive reminders that transformation is possible even from the deepest emptiness. And if someone came to mind while listening, someone who feels tired, lost, or discouraged, sharing this story with them could be the quiet kindness that changes their day. Sometimes, we don't need answers. We just need to know we're not invisible. She didn't realize it yet, but even in this depth of pain, something was shifting. The moment she stopped fighting her exhaustion and allowed herself to be honest with it, life began to respond in subtle, unseen ways. What felt like the end was slowly becoming the place where something entirely new could begin. Her mind kept returning to moments she wished she could rewrite. Not because she believed they would change the outcome, but because they carried unanswered questions that never seemed to rest. She remembered the times she had believed she was close, the moments when life seemed to lean toward her just enough to make her hope, only to pull away again without explanation. Each memory carried a quiet ache, not sharp enough to scream, but persistent enough to linger. Failure had not come as one single collapse. It had arrived gradually, disguised as almosts and not quites. Opportunities that promised direction but dissolved midway. Relationships that felt meaningful but never fully held her. Efforts that required everything she had, yet returned very little. Over time, these experiences merged into a story she didn't remember choosing, but somehow ended up living. She often wondered when she began to feel lost inside her own life. There was no clear moment, no dramatic turning point. It happened subtly, as expectations softened and dreams became quieter. She didn't stop wanting more, she simply stopped believing more was possible for her. And that quiet resignation weighed heavier than any single disappointment. Have you ever felt this too, that strange sense of drifting while still moving forward, of doing everything you know how to do and yet feeling further away from yourself? Have you ever carried the weight of unanswered effort, wondering why sincerity and persistence didn't seem to be enough? She watched others move confidently through life, as if guided by an inner certainty she could not access. Their paths appeared clearer, their steps lighter. She didn't resent them, but their ease amplified her own confusion. It made her question whether she was missing something essential, something everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. Does this touch something inside you, that quiet comparison we rarely admit out loud, the silent wondering of why life feels harder when we're trying so earnestly? She carried that question with her, not as complaint, but as a longing for clarity she didn't yet know how to find. Her emotional wounds weren't dramatic or visible. They were subtle, cumulative, formed by being overlooked, by not being chosen, by watching doors close without knowing why. Each experience left a mark, shaping how she saw herself and what she allowed herself to expect from life. Have you ever carried this kind of invisible weight, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but slowly reshapes your beliefs? She didn't realize how much of her energy had gone into protecting herself from disappointment, into surviving rather than living. And still, beneath all of this, there was a faint awareness she couldn't silence. A sense that her story wasn't meant to end here, even if she didn't yet know how it would continue. She couldn't name it, couldn't trust it fully, but it remained, quietly reminding her that what felt lost might still be waiting to be found. There were moments when she replayed her past not to romanticize it, but to search for answers that never came. She examined her choices with the careful attention of someone trying to understand where the path had quietly shifted. Not out of regret, but confusion. She had followed the rules she was taught, listened to the advice she trusted, done her best with what she knew at the time, and still, life felt strangely unresponsive. Hope had become something she handled with caution. Whenever a possibility appeared, she felt her heart hesitate before opening, already bracing for disappointment. Joy, when it arrived, was brief and guarded, as if celebrating too openly might invite loss sooner. She learned how to temper her expectations, believing that restraint was the same as wisdom. Have you ever felt this too, that subtle fear of believing too much, that instinct to hold back just in case life takes something away again? She carried that fear quietly, letting it shape the way she dreamed, the way she planned, the way she imagined her future. She questioned herself more than she questioned circumstances. Maybe she wasn't clear enough. Maybe she lacked discipline. Maybe she simply wasn't meant for more. These thoughts didn't arrive harshly, they arrived logically, convincingly, disguising themselves as realism. Over time, they became familiar companions, shaping her inner dialogue without her noticing. Does this resonate with you? That habit of turning unanswered prayers into personal judgments, of assuming that silence means refusal? She felt that silence deeply, not as absence, but as a space she didn't know how to interpret. There were days she felt disconnected from her own desires. She knew she wanted something different, but she no longer trusted herself to name it. Wanting felt risky. Expecting felt naive. So she lived carefully, minimizing disappointment by minimizing desire. Have you ever experienced that kind of loss, not of things, but of direction, of clarity, of trust in your own longing? She didn't stop moving forward, but she stopped moving with intention. And yet, beneath all the self-questioning, something remained unresolved. A quiet sense that the story she was telling herself might not be complete. That perhaps life wasn't withholding answers, but waiting for her to listen differently. She didn't know how to do that yet. But the awareness itself was new. And in that awareness, something began to loosen, creating space for a shift she could not yet see, but was already beginning to feel. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from feeling unseen for too long. Not ignored in obvious ways, but overlooked in subtle ones. She showed up, contributed, tried again and again, and still felt as though her efforts dissolved into the background. No recognition, no confirmation, just the quiet sense that her presence didn't quite register. She began to wonder if her voice mattered at all. If her work, her care, her persistence had any real impact beyond her own small world. These questions didn't come from ego or entitlement, but from a deep human need to know that what we give leaves a trace somewhere. And the absence of that trace slowly eroded her confidence. Have you ever felt invisible like this, as if your contribution exists, but somehow goes unnoticed by life itself? She carried that feeling with her through ordinary days, letting it shape the way she spoke, the way she asked, the way she hoped. There were moments she considered giving up, not in a dramatic sense, but quietly, by accepting less than she truly wanted. She told herself that peace meant lowering expectations, that maturity meant letting go of dreams that hurt too much to hold. But something about that never felt right. The ache inside her didn't feel like greed. It felt like something unfinished. Does this echo inside you, that tension between accepting what is and knowing, deep down, that there is more meant for you? She lived inside that tension, trying to reconcile resignation with longing, silence with desire. She noticed how carefully she moved through life now, choosing safety over authenticity, predictability over possibility. It was easier to protect herself than to risk disappointment again. Easier to survive than to hope. And yet, this careful living left her feeling smaller, disconnected from the fullness she sensed was possible. Have you ever carried this kind of quiet compromise, where nothing is technically wrong, but nothing feels truly right either? She didn't know how to articulate it, only that something essential felt out of reach. Still, beneath the layers of caution and fatigue, a subtle awareness remained. A sense that her longing was not a mistake, that her desire for alignment and meaning had a purpose she didn't yet understand. She couldn't see the path forward, but she felt, faintly, that standing still was no longer an option. And right there, in that awareness, something began to prepare itself. Not as a solution yet, but as readiness. A soft internal shift that signaled she was approaching the edge of something new, even if she didn't yet know what it was. The turning point did not arrive as an answer to her questions. It arrived as a pause. A moment when life, instead of demanding more from her, seemed to ask her to stop. To sit. To notice. To listen in a way she never had before. It happened on a day that looked ordinary from the outside, when nothing remarkable was supposed to occur. She found herself alone in the quiet of her home, surrounded by the simplicity of unfinished routines. The noise of the world had softened just enough for her to hear her own thoughts without interruption. And in that stillness, something unexpected surfaced. Not a solution, not a plan, but a gentle awareness that she had been measuring life only by what was missing. She reached for a notebook without knowing why. It wasn't part of a strategy. It wasn't a practice she had learned. It was instinctive, almost involuntary, as if her hands knew something her mind had not yet understood. When she opened it, the blank page didn't intimidate her. It invited her. She didn't write goals. She didn't write requests. What emerged instead were acknowledgments. Small, quiet recognitions of what had carried her this far. A breath she had taken without effort. A moment of calm she hadn't expected. The fact that she was still here, still present, even after everything that had been taken from her. As she wrote, something softened inside her. The tight grip she had held on disappointment loosened, not because the past had changed, but because her relationship with it had. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't asking life to prove itself. She was simply noticing what was already real. Gratitude, she realized, wasn't something you reach for after everything works out. It was something you choose when nothing seems to make sense. And in that choice, something subtle but profound began to shift. The emptiness she had been living with didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became space. She stayed with that feeling longer than she expected, writing slowly, deliberately, without rushing to make meaning of it. There was no rush to fix her life in that moment. Only a quiet willingness to see it differently. To acknowledge what remained instead of only what was lost. In that stillness, she sensed something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement. Not certainty. But relief. The kind that comes when you stop fighting reality and begin meeting it where you are. It was as if life had been waiting for this exact shift, this small opening where effort gave way to awareness. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything turned. Not because circumstances changed, but because her focus did. She had nothing left to grasp for, and in that surrender, she had discovered something far more powerful. The beginning of a different way of living, rooted not in lack, but in recognition. She didn't announce this new beginning to anyone. There was no declaration, no promise to change her life overnight. What emerged instead was a quiet rhythm, almost imperceptible, woven into her days with care. Each morning, before the world could reclaim her attention, she returned to the notebook she had opened the day before. Not with expectation, but with presence. She began simply. One line at a time. Not searching for extraordinary reasons to be grateful, but noticing what had always gone unnoticed. The warmth of light entering the room. The steadiness of her breath. The fact that she could sit in silence without needing to escape it. These were not victories. They were acknowledgments. At first, her hand hesitated as she wrote. Part of her still believed gratitude was something reserved for better days, for moments of success or relief. But something inside her insisted otherwise. It asked her to stay with what was real, not what was missing. To honor what remained, even if it felt small. She didn't force emotion into the practice. Some days, the words came easily. Other days, they felt mechanical, almost distant. She allowed both. The practice wasn't about feeling good. It was about seeing clearly. About meeting her life without judgment, without demand. Slowly, something unexpected happened. Her attention shifted. She noticed moments she would have previously overlooked. A sense of calm during an ordinary task. A brief feeling of steadiness when she would have expected anxiety. These moments didn't change her circumstances, but they changed how she inhabited them. She began to understand that gratitude wasn't an escape from reality. It was a way of entering it more fully. By acknowledging what was present, she was no longer consumed by what wasn't. The constant tension she carried began to soften, replaced by a quiet awareness that she was supported in ways she hadn't known how to see before. This practice extended beyond the page. She paused more often during the day, noticing her reactions, her thoughts, the way she moved through space. She became gentler with herself, not because she had fixed anything, but because she was finally listening. There was no rush. No expectation of transformation. Only a commitment to return, again and again, to this simple act of recognition. Each entry became less about listing and more about presence. Less about gratitude as a concept and more about gratitude as a way of being. She didn't realize it yet, but these small practices were quietly reshaping her inner world. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But steadily, like water carving its way through stone. And in that steadiness, something new began to take root, preparing her for signs she had not yet learned to recognize. The first signs did not arrive as answers. They arrived as shifts in perception. Ordinary moments began to feel slightly different, as if something beneath the surface had rearranged itself without announcing the change. She noticed how her mornings felt less heavy, how the familiar weight in her chest no longer greeted her as insistently as before. There were small coincidences she would have dismissed in the past. A thought she wrote in her notebook appearing later in a conversation. A message arriving at the exact moment she felt uncertain. A sense of calm settling in situations that once triggered anxiety. None of these moments were dramatic, but together they formed a quiet pattern she could no longer ignore. She found herself responding differently to challenges. Where frustration once arose automatically, there was now a pause. Where fear once dominated, curiosity began to appear. It wasn't that life had become easier, but her relationship with it had softened, allowing her to move through moments without resistance. As she continued writing, she noticed her words changing. Less about what she wanted to escape. More about what she was learning to see. Gratitude had become less of an exercise and more of a lens, gently guiding her attention toward what supported her instead of what depleted her. Have you ever experienced this, that subtle sense that something is shifting even when nothing visible has changed yet? That quiet reassurance that you are being guided, even if you don't know where the path leads? She trusted these signs without demanding proof. They didn't promise outcomes. They offered presence. And presence, she was learning, was enough to keep moving forward without fear. If something inside you feels familiar while listening to this, you might pause for just a moment and leave the words I receive in the comments. Not as certainty, but as openness. A simple acknowledgement that you are willing to notice what is already responding to you. She didn't chase these signs. She allowed them. And with each one, her trust deepened, not in circumstances, but in her ability to meet life with awareness instead of expectation. She didn't yet know where this path would lead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that she was walking with life instead of against it. The changes began to show themselves in ways she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Not sudden miracles, not dramatic reversals, but tangible shifts that altered the rhythm of her days. A conversation unfolded with unexpected kindness. A situation that once felt stuck resolved itself without effort. She noticed how life seemed to meet her halfway now, responding gently rather than resisting. Emotionally, the relief was unmistakable. The constant tension she had carried for so long began to ease, allowing space for a steadiness she hadn't known before. She felt less reactive, less consumed by anticipation or regret. There was room to breathe, to pause, to trust her own responses instead of bracing for disappointment. Her gratitude practice deepened naturally. What had started as quiet acknowledgement became a source of grounding. Writing no longer felt like something she needed to remember to do. It felt like returning to herself. Each entry reflected not just what she appreciated, but who she was becoming as she learned to see life differently. She noticed how her interactions changed. People responded to her with more openness, more warmth. It wasn't that they had changed, but that she was meeting them without the armor she once wore. Her presence carried a calm assurance that invited connection instead of distance. Opportunities appeared without force. Not as rewards, but as reflections of alignment. She found herself in the right place at the right time, guided by intuition rather than urgency. Decisions felt clearer, not because the path was obvious, but because she trusted herself to navigate it. Have you ever felt this shift, when effort gives way to flow and things begin to move without struggle? She recognized that feeling now, not as luck, but as cooperation with life itself. Challenges still existed, but they no longer defined her. She met them with perspective, seeing them as moments to respond consciously rather than react automatically. The sense of being tested faded, replaced by the feeling of being supported. What had once felt like emptiness was now space. Space for clarity, for connection, for something new to emerge. She didn't need to know exactly what was coming next. The change she felt was enough to remind her that life had not abandoned her. It had been waiting for her to notice it differently. As the changes settled into her life, something else began to expand quietly alongside them. It wasn't ambition in the old sense, driven by urgency or fear of falling behind. It was a gentle widening, an inner permission to imagine again without immediately preparing for disappointment. Ideas surfaced naturally, not as pressure, but as invitations. She noticed how her days felt more coherent. Small actions seemed to connect to one another, forming a rhythm that made sense. She trusted her timing more, no longer measuring herself against invisible deadlines. Life didn't feel like something she had to chase. It felt like something she was gradually stepping into. Her gratitude practice continued, not as a tool to fix anything, but as a way to stay present. Writing became a moment of alignment, a pause where she could recognize how far she had come without needing external confirmation. The pages reflected steadiness, clarity, and an emerging confidence that didn't need to announce itself. She began to see herself differently. Not as someone recovering from loss, but as someone integrating it. The past no longer felt like a failure to escape, but a foundation that had shaped her resilience and awareness. Each experience, even the painful ones, had refined her ability to listen to herself and to life. Have you ever noticed this shift, when your relationship with your past changes and it stops holding you back? She felt that release now, not as forgetting, but as understanding. The weight she once carried no longer defined her movement. Support appeared in subtle ways. Conversations flowed more easily. Collaboration replaced resistance. People seemed more receptive, not because she demanded space, but because she occupied it with quiet confidence. Her presence felt grounded, and that grounding invited trust. She no longer rushed to define where this expansion would lead. There was comfort in not knowing everything at once. She allowed the process to unfold, aware that clarity grows through participation, not control. What once felt like survival had transformed into engagement. She wasn't merely enduring her days anymore. She was inhabiting them, aware that growth doesn't always arrive as change, but often as depth. And with that depth came a subtle but unmistakable sense that she was entering a new phase of her life, one shaped not by lack, but by awareness and gratitude guiding her forward. With this expansion came an awakening that felt less like discovery and more like remembering. She began to sense herself from the inside out, no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had learned to hold. There was a steadiness in her now, a quiet assurance that didn't depend on outcomes or approval. She noticed how her inner dialogue softened. The voice that once questioned every step now spoke with patience, offering guidance instead of criticism. When doubt appeared, it didn't take over. It paused, waited, and often dissolved on its own. She realized she no longer needed to fight her thoughts to move forward. Awareness was enough. Her gratitude practice deepened into something almost instinctive. She no longer needed to sit and write to feel it, though she still did. Gratitude appeared in motion, in conversation, in the way she responded to life's unpredictability. It was woven into how she lived, not just how she reflected. There were moments she caught herself smiling inwardly, not from happiness, but from recognition. A recognition that she was no longer searching for permission to exist fully. She had given it to herself. The emptiness that once defined her had become a spaciousness that allowed clarity to rise. Have you ever felt this kind of awakening, when nothing dramatic changes on the outside, yet everything feels different on the inside? She lived in that shift now, trusting it even when she couldn't explain it. Her intuition grew clearer, less clouded by fear. Decisions felt guided, not rushed. She honored what felt aligned and stepped away from what didn't without guilt. This discernment didn't isolate her. It grounded her. She understood now that gratitude wasn't something she practiced to receive more. It was something she embodied because she had learned how to see. And seeing clearly changed everything. She didn't claim certainty about the future. What she carried instead was trust. Trust in her ability to respond. Trust in the unfolding. Trust that even if the path changed again, she would remain anchored. This awakening didn't announce itself as an arrival. It felt like a continuation, a natural evolution of everything she had already lived through. And in that continuity, she sensed that her life was no longer something happening to her. It was something she was consciously participating in. As this inner awakening settled, her world began to respond in ways that felt both surprising and familiar. Possibilities she had once dismissed as unrealistic now appeared within reach, not because circumstances had dramatically changed, but because she was no longer closing herself off to them. She noticed how her openness created space for life to meet her differently. Opportunities arose gently, without urgency or pressure. Invitations came that aligned with who she was becoming, not who she had been trying to be. She felt a sense of coherence between her inner world and her outer experiences, as if the two were finally speaking the same language. Her gratitude remained the quiet foundation beneath everything. Each acknowledgement reinforced her sense of belonging in her own life. She didn't chase abundance, she recognized it in forms she hadn't valued before. Time, clarity, connection, and peace revealed themselves as meaningful expressions of richness. Have you ever experienced this, when your definition of success begins to change and life feels fuller because of it? She lived inside that redefinition now, allowing herself to value depth over speed, alignment over accumulation. She became more receptive to collaboration, trusting that support did not diminish her independence. Working with others felt nourishing rather than draining. There was a sense of mutual respect that replaced the isolation she once carried. Her sense of purpose grew quietly. It didn't demand attention or validation. It simply guided her choices, offering direction without pressure. She felt connected to something larger than her circumstances, something that made each step feel intentional even when the outcome remained unclear. Challenges still appeared, but they no longer felt personal. She met them with curiosity, aware that each experience carried information rather than judgment. This perspective freed her from the need to prove herself, allowing her to respond thoughtfully instead of defensively. As she moved through this phase of expansion, she recognized that gratitude had not given her everything all at once. It had given her the ability to see what was already unfolding. And in that seeing, her life continued to open, inviting her forward with quiet confidence. With each step forward, the expansion she felt began to deepen rather than widen. It was no longer about adding more to her life, but about inhabiting it more fully. She noticed how her days carried a sense of intention that had once been missing. Even ordinary moments felt anchored in presence, no longer rushed or overlooked. She trusted herself in ways she hadn't before. When uncertainty appeared, she didn't interpret it as a sign to stop. She saw it as space, room for insight, for patience, for growth that couldn't be forced. This trust didn't make her passive. It made her attentive. She listened more carefully to what felt aligned and stepped away from what no longer resonated. Gratitude continued to guide her choices quietly. It shaped how she evaluated opportunities, how she invested her energy, how she defined fulfillment. She understood now that abundance was not something to chase, but something to recognize and cultivate through awareness. Have you ever felt this shift, when life begins to feel less fragmented and more integrated, as if different parts of you are finally moving in the same direction? She lived inside that integration, allowing her actions and values to align naturally. Her relationships reflected this change. Boundaries formed without conflict. Connections deepened without effort. She felt comfortable expressing her needs and honoring those of others, grounded in a sense of self that no longer needed constant reassurance. She also noticed a new patience within herself. The urgency that once drove her had softened. She allowed things to unfold in their own time, trusting that what was meant to grow would do so without force. This patience didn't feel like waiting. It felt like participating in a rhythm she could finally hear. The gratitude she practiced was no longer separate from her identity. It was present in how she spoke, how she listened, how she responded to life's unpredictability. It reminded her daily that even when circumstances shifted, her inner stability remained. She didn't claim to have all the answers. What she carried instead was confidence in her ability to adapt, to learn, and to stay present. This confidence didn't announce itself. It settled quietly, shaping her life from within. And as this deeper expansion continued, she sensed that what she had gained went far beyond what she had once believed she had lost. Gratitude had not replaced her dreams. It had transformed them into something more sustainable, more aligned, and deeply her own. She didn't notice the visibility at first. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, woven into ordinary moments. People began to listen differently when she spoke. Conversations lingered a little longer. Invitations appeared where silence once lived. It wasn't admiration she felt, but recognition, a sense that others were responding to the steadiness she carried now. Her presence seemed to create space. Not by demanding attention, but by offering clarity. She spoke from experience rather than effort, and that authenticity resonated. What she shared didn't sound rehearsed or perfected. It sounded lived. And that made people lean in. She noticed how her story began to move beyond her. Someone would mention how a simple perspective shift helped them breathe again. Another would say they felt less alone after hearing her speak. These reflections touched her deeply, not because they elevated her, but because they confirmed that meaning multiplies when it's shared. Have you ever experienced this, when something you once struggled through becomes the very thing that allows you to connect with others? She understood now that her past had not disqualified her. It had prepared her to meet people with honesty instead of advice. She remained anchored in gratitude as this visibility grew. It kept her grounded, reminding her that recognition was not the goal. Alignment was. She continued to return to the quiet practices that had reshaped her life, knowing that what sustained her mattered more than what celebrated her. There was humility in this phase, not as self-diminishment, but as balance. She allowed herself to be seen without losing herself. To receive appreciation without letting it define her. Visibility no longer felt dangerous. It felt natural. If this part of her journey resonates with you, you might feel moved to share a word in the comments that reflects where you are right now. And if you'd like to stay connected to stories that speak gently to the soul, subscribing is simply a way of choosing that connection. She didn't chase recognition. She met it calmly, knowing it was a reflection of the inner work she had committed to long before anyone else noticed. As everything settled into place, she realized that what had changed most was not her circumstances, but her relationship with them. Life no longer felt like a sequence of obstacles to overcome or problems to solve. It felt like a conversation she had learned how to participate in with honesty and attention. The weight she once carried had transformed into perspective. She reflected on the moment she believed she had nothing left. How absolute that emptiness had felt. How convincing the idea of finality had been. And yet, standing where she was now, she could see that what she had lost was not everything. What she had lost was the illusion that fulfillment comes from force. What remained was something far more durable. Gratitude had not erased her struggles. It had given them context. It allowed her to see how each experience, even the painful ones, had shaped her capacity to remain open. Through gratitude, she had learned to meet life without armor, trusting that presence itself was a form of strength. Have you ever noticed how meaning changes when you stop resisting what has already happened and begin learning from it? She lived inside that understanding now, aware that acceptance did not mean agreement, but clarity. It was clarity that freed her from repeating old patterns. She no longer measured her life by what it lacked. She measured it by how fully she inhabited each moment. This shift didn't make everything easy, but it made everything real. And real was enough to build something sustainable, something honest. The gratitude that once felt like a fragile practice had become an inner posture. It shaped her responses, softened her judgments, and guided her decisions. It reminded her daily that even when outcomes remained uncertain, her presence was not. She felt rooted in herself in a way she had never known before. Not anchored by success or approval, but by awareness. The awareness that she could meet life as it was and still choose how to respond. And in that choice, she found everything she thought she had lost. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But steadily, meaningfully, and in ways that would continue unfolding long after this chapter ended. When you reach the place where nothing seems left, something essential becomes possible. Not because life suddenly gives more, but because you begin to see what has been there all along. As time moved forward, she noticed that the sense of purpose growing within her no longer felt heavy or demanding. It didn't ask her to prove anything or rush toward a destination. It simply guided her gently, like an inner compass that had finally calibrated itself. She followed it without anxiety, trusting that each step was enough on its own. Her days unfolded with a quiet coherence. Small actions carried meaning. Choices felt aligned without requiring overthinking. She understood that purpose was not something to be discovered all at once, but something revealed through attention and care. The more present she became, the clearer her direction felt. She continued to return to gratitude, not because she feared losing what she had gained, but because it grounded her in what mattered. Gratitude reminded her to notice the subtleties that once went unseen. The way a simple routine could hold peace. The way stillness could offer guidance. The way presence could transform even the most ordinary moments. Have you ever sensed this kind of purpose, one that doesn't announce itself loudly but feels steady and true? She lived inside that steadiness now, allowing it to shape her decisions without pressure. There was freedom in not needing everything to be defined. Her confidence grew quietly. Not as certainty about outcomes, but as trust in her ability to meet whatever arose. She no longer feared losing everything again, because she understood that what sustained her was not external. It was the relationship she had built with herself and with life. She noticed how this inner alignment influenced those around her. People felt calmer in her presence. Conversations felt more grounded. She didn't try to inspire anyone. She simply showed up as she was, and that authenticity spoke for itself. The life she was living now did not erase her past. It integrated it. Each experience, each loss, each moment of emptiness had contributed to the depth she carried. Nothing had been wasted. Everything had shaped her capacity to live with awareness. As this understanding settled, she felt a quiet gratitude for the journey itself. Not just for where it had led her, but for who it had allowed her to become. She didn't need to label this feeling. She simply honored it. She sensed that this expansion was ongoing, not something that would end or resolve completely. Life would continue to unfold, offering new questions, new invitations, new moments of presence. And she felt ready to meet them, not with force, but with openness. Looking back, she could finally see how close she had been to misunderstanding her own story. What she once believed was the end had never been an ending at all. It had been a clearing. A moment when everything unnecessary fell away so something truer could take its place. She hadn't been emptied to be punished. She had been emptied to be filled differently. She understood now that gratitude had not arrived to decorate her life, but to reorient it. When she had nothing left to hold on to, gratitude taught her how to stand without grasping. It showed her that abundance does not always begin with receiving, but with recognizing. Recognizing breath, presence, awareness. The quiet strength of continuing even when nothing seems to respond. Her life did not transform because she forced it to. It transformed because she softened enough to listen. Because she learned to meet each moment without resistance, without bargaining, without despair. In that meeting, life responded in ways she could never have planned. She knew challenges would still come. Loss, uncertainty, and change were part of being human. But she no longer feared reaching the bottom, because she had discovered something essential there. Even when everything else disappears, awareness remains. Gratitude remains. Choice remains. And that is the truth she would offer now, gently, to anyone listening. If you are in a place where you feel you have nothing left, you are not broken. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You may simply be standing at the place where a different kind of fullness becomes possible. If this story touched something inside you, you might take a moment to leave a word in the comments that reflects where you are right now. A simple acknowledgement. A quiet signal to yourself that you are open, that you are present, that you are listening. If you feel called to stay connected to stories like this, subscribing is a way of choosing to walk alongside reminders that transformation often begins in stillness, not struggle. And if someone you love came to mind while listening, sharing this story could be the kindness that reaches them at the exact moment they need it. Before you go, you may also choose to leave a small gesture of gratitude in the comments. Not for perfection. Not for arrival. But for the courage to remain present through it all. Because sometimes, having nothing left is not the end of the story. It is the moment when gratitude finally gives you everything.